Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're heading deep into the Indonesian archipelago for a story acclaimed so specific it seems to connect an incredibly remote, isolated people to a truly global mystery.
I mean, listen to this. Ancestors descended from the Pleiades in a starship. It sounds like something straight out of a modern sci-fi movie, right? But this is a deeply held tradition recorded way before we even had a space age. So let's jump in and see where the evidence takes us.
Okay, so to really get why this story is so incredible, you first have to understand the people who tell it. For the Toraja, context is everything. We're talking about where they lived and just how completely cut off they were from the rest of the world. So, their home is this place called Tanah Toraja. Picture these rugged, cloud-piercing mountains way up in the Indonesian highlands. For centuries, this landscape wasn't just, a pretty view, it was a fortress. It literally sealed them off from the rest of human history. 1906. Let that sink in for a second. Until 1906, the Toraja had no idea about ancient Rome, the Silk Road, the Great World religions, nothing. Their isolation was so complete, it was like a time capsule. It preserved a worldview that was just ancient.
And that worldview has a name, Aluk Todolo, which means the way of the ancestors. And here's the really crucial part. Ethnographers documented all this immediately after first contact. So what we have is this pristine snapshot of their beliefs before any major outside influence could creep in. And right at the heart of it all is one heck of an origin story.
All right, so let's get right to the core of that tradition. This is where their story of how humanity began takes a very, very specific and frankly, very strange turn. See, at the center of it all is the To Manurun. And this isn't some distant spiritual figure, okay? They are considered the literal, physical ancestor of the Torajan nobility. Just think about that for a second. A ruling class that traces its bloodline directly to a being who was not from Earth. And what's just absolutely wild is what this ancestor supposedly brought with them. This wasn't just a bit of wisdom or a few moral lessons. It was, for all intents and purposes, a complete civilizational starter pack. I mean, look at this. Architecture, law, religion, agriculture, everything you need to build a society from the ground up.
And this is where things get really interesting, because the Torajan view is so different from other ancient accounts we know. For them, this transfer of knowledge was a sacred gift. It was the founding act of their entire civilization. It's the polar opposite of, say, the Enochic tradition, right? We have the heavenly watchers bringing knowledge, and it's seen as this terrible, sinful thing that corrupts humanity. It's basically the same story, but with a totally different moral takeaway.
And that brings us to the most specific and, honestly, the most provocative detail in their entire tradition. This isn't some vague symbolic tale. It's a precise astronomical claim. And it's the one detail that connects this super isolated tribe to a genuine worldwide mystery.
So, where did this ancestor come from? Well, their tradition doesn't just say the sky or the heavens. Nope. It gives a specific location. It's like an address in the cosmos.
The Pleiades. That's right. Their oral history claims their ancestors came specifically from that star cluster. And that single detail, which they held on to for centuries in total isolation, well, that's what suddenly makes this little local story part of a much bigger and much, much stranger global conversation.
And this right here lays out the central puzzle perfectly. You've got three ancient traditions separated by vast oceans and thousands of years with no plausible way they could have swapped stories. Yet you have the Toraja in Indonesia, the Aboriginal Australians, and the ancient writers of the Enochic texts, all pointing to the exact same, relatively faint cluster of stars as the origin point for these otherworldly visitors. Now that is a pattern that is really, really hard to just explain away as a coincidence. But wait, there's more. The Torajan story doesn't just exist in a vacuum. If we zoom out and look across the whole Indonesian archipelago, we start to see other pieces of the puzzle. We see echoes of this same framework, suggesting a much wider, much more ancient memory. For example, let's look at the neighboring island of Java. Their oldest myths talk about the Denawa, a race of violent, cannibalistic giants who had to be wiped out before human civilization could even start. Does that sound familiar? It's an almost perfect parallel to the Nephilim from the Book of Enoch, a pre-civilizational race of giants whose destruction was necessary to make the world safe for humans.
And then you've got Bali with his concept of Acintya. This is a single, formless, supreme god. They call him the inconceivable, who is the source of everything but can never, ever be depicted in an image.
this idea of an original, non-idolatrous high god, it mirrors what we find in other really ancient, isolated traditions. It suggests maybe a common theological starting point before all the later pantheons of gods showed up.
Okay, now we have to put a pin in this for a second. For the sake of intellectual honesty, we need to talk about what mainstream anthropology says. The general belief is that the Toraja are descended from voyagers who came from southern China around 3000 BC. So what that could mean is that their myths share a very, very ancient common ancestor with Chinese myths. And if that's the case, it makes the parallels a little less surprising than, say, the connection to Australia, which was in extreme isolation.
But, even with that caveat, the central mystery doesn't just disappear. If anything, it just pushes the question further back in time. We are still left with the Pleiades. Why? Why that specific, pretty unassuming star cluster? Why does it show up as the home of heavenly founders in Indonesia, Australia, and the ancient Near East? Coincidence in psychology that can only stretch so far. And it leaves you with a final, really provocative thought. What if these aren't just myths? What if they are fragmented memories of a history we have long, long forgotten?